Okay, so this module is going to look at the issue of group guidance and online career learning as part of your sort of overall range of tools that you've got to apply when you're thinking about e-guidance and online learning. So we're going to work through a number of different key issues, and let's start with why work with groups at all. So I suppose the first reason that people often think about when they're thinking about why to work with groups is the efficiency. So if we move from working with one person to working with many people, then in theory at least we become a lot more efficient. I don't think this is the most helpful way to think about it because I think there are actually some value of working in groups that is kind of much beyond this really. So I draw this from Vygotsky, and Vygotsky argues that learning is a social process and that it takes place through interactions with other people. So students learn from their peers as well as teachers, and because of that it's important for us to have opportunities to actually to allow students to work with each other as well as to work with us. And so the group actually potentially brings more deep and more opportunities for learning. So we then have a role to encourage interaction, discussion and sharing as a way of supporting learning. And of course, career is also a social process, just like learning. So other people, what we might describe as social capital, provide us with resources that we can use to learn and enact our career. So the learners that you're working with might be supporting each other in their career long after you've stopped working with them. And forming peer communities can support both career learning and career enactment. So both finding out about career and then actually making your way in the world having a career. Career education is a place that these kinds of formation of peer communities can actually happen. So if we think about some of the challenges of working with groups online, I suppose one of the most difficult challenges is that quite naturally in a normal classroom or learning situation, students will make friends with each other, they will interact with each other, they'll go for coffee afterwards. And it's very difficult to ensure that in an online environment. Another problem is that there's a sort of tradition that sometimes described online as content is king, and in the classroom as the sage on the stage. So the idea that the teacher is at the front of the classroom, the most important person. And those ideas really can endure if you're not careful online as well. So that leads the students to direct everything they do towards the teacher, and the teacher to always be intervening and discussing directly with students. So that's something to be really careful about. And the other thing is that technology can get in the way, so we can end up with lots of situations where students are kind of pressing buttons and running around doing lots of interactive things, but they're not actually talking to each other. So we have to actually start to think about how we overcome that. Thankfully, there's some good ways to do it, and I've provided you with some links elsewhere in this module that you can work with. But I think increasingly people are used to interacting online. It's not something strange or unusual. So through Facebook and through various other online social media type technologies, people are used to kind of discussing and interacting. But it can be quite difficult to force this to happen as part of an online course. And that's kind of what we've been trying to do in this course with you, is to force some interaction by giving you tasks. So in the classroom, you would use things like icebreakers, discussions, group activities, joint projects that students might do outside of class. These would all be things that you would use to bring students together and to foster a peer community, a community of practice, of learners coming together. So why can't we do the same online? Well, in fact, we can. Many of these techniques are quite easy to translate into online learning. And that's where the idea that we've introduced to you before, really at the beginning of this course, of the idea of instructional design is really important. So instructional design, which we've talked about before, but also is discussed in another lecture this week, encourages you to think about learning as something that you need to actually design. So where is it? What's going to happen? What's involved? How are the people going to interact with each other? And to what end? And you need to think all of these things through and set things up in such a way as you have a clear design. And you would do that in any case, in any kind of environment, but when you're online, you tend to have to think about what the technology will support and afford for you. So if you want to get people engaged, you have to design learning in a way that encourages or requires engagement. So I've provided you with a link to Gilly Salmon herself talking about her 5-stage model. So I won't go into a lot of detail about that here. But I think the point is that what Salmon has done in her 5-stage model is think about a process whereby learners get to know each other, they send and receive messages, they exchange information, they build knowledge, and then they develop ideas out of that. And this is a kind of structured process whereby interaction takes place, but interaction in a purposeful way, which ultimately serves the learning aims that you have. So Salmon and other people talk about the idea of eativities. So that's the idea of an online activity which supports learning. And so there are some things that are useful to think about as components of that. So at the heart of it, we need some kind of tool, some kind of way that people can interact. So that can be a discussion board, it can be an online webinar or classroom, ways that people can talk to each other. But they need some way to talk to each other. So into that we then feed content. So we need something that provides some knowledge, provides some information, which students can think about and engage with. But then we also need a task about what we expect them to do with that knowledge. So we're not just asking them to learn it, we're asking them to actually think about how they use that knowledge in the course. Now, in order to do that, we need some facilitation. So we have a really important role as an e-learning tutor or facilitator to help students to think about, okay, what kind of tasks they do, to answer their questions, to link them up and get them talking to each other. But part of that facilitation is also the idea of consequences. And one of the things that often happens is when people set up e-learning environments, they find that students don't talk, and that's usually because they've not offered them any consequences if they don't talk. So we've made the participation in the course, participation in the discussion board, and posting on the discussion board in this course a requirement of the course. You can't pass the course without doing it. And so we have those consequences for not participating. And then of course finally you need learners who can go in, engage with the content, perform the tasks, interact with each other, respond to your facilitation and so on. And that's enough, but it's important to say that there are some courses that you can't do with very small numbers. In fact, having, I would say, probably 5 learners is essential. Many of these things don't really work if you don't have that sort of many. So okay, let's look at an example of career learning to think about how this actually works in practice. So the first thing I think is that career learning is fundamentally like any other learning. And one of the metaphors that we use to describe what I've been talking about so far, these ideas of structures and instructional design and eativities, these are scaffolds around which we build around students in order to help them learn, to help them climb higher, find out more. And so our role as an instructional designer, as an e-learning tutor, is to build and maintain that scaffolding for learners. And that's just as true in career learning as in any other learning. So if I give you an example of a career learning activity, which is called Career Hopes, I'll give you the reference at the end of this lecture. So Career Hopes was an experimental online career learning intervention. It's quite a few years ago now, but it's, I think, really interesting one, and it gives us some really clear evidence. And it was found to have some impacts on career decidedness, on students' occupationally relevant self-knowledge and career exploration. And that was done in a kind of randomized control trial sort of way. So different students had different kinds of interventions, and they found that this intervention was the most effective. So what are the components, what are the kind of pieces of the activities that made up Career Hope, the Career Hopes intervention? Well, the first was that there were some online lessons, so there was some content, much like I'm doing now. We provide some content. Second thing was that they were set some homework tasks, go off and do some things. Third thing is they were provided with resources that were beyond the lessons. You'll recognise a lot of this from the way that this course works. They were then required to participate in a discussion group, and there was a career counsellor acting as a moderator in that group. So let's look at what they did in detail. So it's a 4-week course, the Careers Hopes intervention. Week 1, they had an introduction to the course. They were provided with some information on career decision making, in structured tasks, including they did some tasks like completing a self-assessment and generating a list of career ideas. They then had some discussion activities which introduced the participants to each other and got them discussing their ideal job. In week 2, they then discussed the homework tasks that they'd done, and they were given new information about the idea of dysfunctional career ideas and then matching jobs to interests. These were new ideas that were introduced. They were then given some structured tasks based on the completion of a career assessment using the Holland codes, and then asked to go off and research ideal jobs. So in week 3, they then came back, they discussed their homework tasks, they were provided with new information which focused this time on values and skills, and then they were given more structured tasks which got them to use some online career tools and career assessments around values, and then they interviewed someone else about their job. In week 4, they came once again, they discussed the homework tasks, they received some information about job search tools, they revisited the key learning of the course, and then finally learners were encouraged to exchange emails and continue to support each other. And this is the idea that I started with here, that that learning is a social process, but so is career. And so we both encourage people in their career learning by supporting them to learn, by linking them up to other people who can help them to learn, but also by linking them to long-term career resources in the form of social capital. So that's the Career Hopes intervention, which gives you some examples of how this can actually work in practice. I've added some references here that you might find useful. So in summary, I think we can say that online group-based learning offers huge opportunities for career education. However, online learning requires careful design if it's going to be effective. And Salmon's approach offers a useful framework, and I'd really encourage you to engage with that. Watch the video that I've provided in the lecture section, but also read a bit more widely on some of her work. I've got a link in the reading to her resources. And then the Career Hopes experiment provides some evidence that this kind of thing actually works in practice. Thank you for listening.